Welcome, dear listener, to the Silent Archives, where the mists of ancient history part gently to reveal mysteries that have captivated minds for centuries. Tonight, we journey together not to a beach in modern Australia, but to the far northern reaches of the Roman Empire, to a time when legions marched across continents and disappeared into legend. As you settle into comfort, allowing the weight of your day to gradually dissolve, know that you are safe here, in this space we share. The story I'm about to tell you is one of genuine historical mystery, a puzzle that has challenged scholars, archaeologists, and historians for generations. Yet, in its telling, there is a strange piece, a reminder that even the mightiest empires left questions in their wake, and that sometimes the most profound mysteries are those that invite us to simply wonder. Take a gentle breath with me now. Feel yourself becoming more comfortable with each passing moment. The world outside can wait. Here, in these archives of sleeping stories, time moves differently. We can traverse centuries in a heartbeat, walk alongside legionaries who marched these same mental landscapes nearly 2,000 years ago. Before we begin our journey to the northern frontier of Roman Britain, let's take a few moments to prepare ourselves for the story ahead. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and imagine yourself standing on an ancient road. The year doesn't matter just yet. Time itself seems to pause here, waiting patiently for you to be ready. Feel the worn stones beneath your feet, smoothed by countless marching boots, by wagon wheels carrying supplies to distant outposts. The road stretches endlessly before you, built to last millennia, yet leading to a destination that history has somehow lost. Each stone that comprises this road carries with it the weight of empire, the ambition of Rome, and the footsteps of men who would vanish from all records. The engineering of these roads was itself a marvel. Roman surveyors planned them with mathematical precision, ensuring they ran as straight as the terrain would allow. Legionaries themselves often built these roads, layer upon layer of carefully selected materials. First, they would excavate a foundation trench. Then came large stones for drainage, followed by layers of smaller stones and gravel, compacted earth mixed with lime, and finally, the top surface of fitted stone blocks. These roads were built not just for a single campaign, but for centuries of use. They were the arteries of empire, carrying not just soldiers but ideas, trade goods, culture itself. Breathe in slowly, matching your breath to the rhythm of marching feet. In through your nose, feeling the cool air fill your lungs. Hold for just a moment at the top of your breath, then release gently through your mouth. Like the eternal rhythm of empire, rising and falling, your breathing finds its natural pace, in and out, constant and calm. The legion we're exploring tonight is called Legio IX Hispana, the Ninth Legion. But before we arrive at that moment in history when it vanished from all records, let yourself simply be present with the timeless quality of military life, of men bound together by duty and oath, marching toward an unknown fate. The air carries a peculiar clarity that seems to sharpen our understanding, while simultaneously soothing our need for definitive answers. Picture the horizon where earth meets sky. That infinite line that has captivated humanity since we first stood upright and wondered what lay beyond. It's a boundary that seems definite from a distance but becomes impossible to pin down, always shifting as we approach. Much like the mystery we're about to explore, some things are meant to be contemplated rather than conclusively solved. Your body continues to relax, growing heavier and more comfortable with each breath. Any remaining tension in your shoulders melts away like morning mist burned off by the rising Sunday. Your jaw unclenches, your forehead smooths. You are becoming part of the eternal rhythm of history, the endless march of time carrying us forward while leaving some questions behind. Now, as we prepare to step into our story, remember that you can drift away at any time. The narrative will continue, my voice, a gentle current that can carry you into sleep whenever you're ready. There's no need to remember every detail, no test at the end. Simply let the story wash over you like a river flowing through time, taking from it whatever feels right for you tonight. Our story begins not with a disappearance, but with a beginning. For to understand what was lost, we must first know what existed. The Ninth Legion was formed in the tumultuous final decades of the Roman Republic, sometime around 59 or 58 years before the Common Era. Its creator was a young, ambitious general named Gaius Julius Caesar, a man whose name would become synonymous with empire itself. Caesar was preparing for his conquest of Gaul, that vast territory encompassing much of modern France, Belgium, and Western Germany. He needed legions, those fundamental units of Roman military power, each comprising roughly 5,000 men organized into cohorts and centuries, bound together by discipline, training, and the promise of glory. The Ninth Legion was one of his instruments for reshaping the world. The men who joined the Ninth Legion in those early days could not have imagined the centuries of service that lay ahead. They were Romans and Italians primarily, citizens who had the right to serve in the legions, seeking fortune, land grants upon retirement, and the pride of serving Rome. They wore segmented armor that clinked as they marched, carried the gladius, that short, brutal sword that had conquered the Mediterranean, and hefted the pilum, the heavy javelin designed to pierce shields and disable enemy defenses. The pilum itself was an ingenious weapon, perfectly embodying Roman military pragmatism. Its soft iron shaft would bend upon impact, making it impossible for enemies to throw back and weighing down their shields if it stuck. This small detail, this careful attention to the mechanics of warfare, was typical of Roman military thinking. Nothing was left to chance. Every piece of equipment had been refined over generations of combat experience. Caesar's Gallic campaigns were brutal affairs, a mixture of military genius and ruthless pragmatism. The Ninth Legion fought alongside Caesar through forests and across rivers, building bridges that were marvels of engineering, constructing fortifications with astonishing speed, and engaging in battles that would be studied for centuries. They were present when Caesar invaded Britain for the first time in 55 years before the Common Era, setting foot on an island that would become intimately connected with the Legion's ultimate fate. That first British expedition was more reconnaissance than conquest. The Romans encountered fierce resistance from the native tribes, warriors who fought from chariots in a style of warfare the legions had not seen for centuries. The weather proved treacherous, storms damaging the Roman fleet. But Caesar had made his point. He had crossed the ocean, that mysterious body of water the Greeks called Okeanos, which they believed encircled the known world. He had touched the mysterious island the Greeks had written about, where tin was mined and druids practiced their ancient rites. But Caesar's ambitions reached beyond Gaul. When civil war erupted between Caesar and Pompey the Great, when the Roman Republic tore itself apart in a struggle between rival generals, the Ninth Legion marched with Caesar. They crossed the Rubicon, that fateful river whose name became synonymous with the point of no return. They fought at Dyrrhachium and Pharsalus, those epic battles where the future of Rome was decided with sword and shield. The legion's loyalty to Caesar was absolute, and when he emerged victorious, when he became dictator of Rome, the Ninth Legion shared in his glory. But empires are built by more than military victory alone. They require administration, consolidation, the patient work of turning conquest into civilization. And so the Ninth Legion, like all of Rome's military units, found itself engaged in the long, grinding work of occupation and pacification. After Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March in 44 years before the Common Era, when senators' daggers ended the life of Rome's greatest general, the Ninth Legion found itself in a world of renewed civil war. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, claimed the legion for his own cause. They fought in the wars that would transform Octavian into Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, the man who would end the Republic and establish the empire. The transition from Republic to Empire was not merely a change of government, but a fundamental transformation of Roman society. The chaos of the late Republic, with its endless civil wars and competing generals, gave way to the stability of imperial rule. The legions, which had been personal armies loyal to individual commanders, became instruments of the state, loyal to the emperor alone. The Ninth Legion experienced this transformation firsthand, shifting from Caesar's personal troops to soldiers of the Roman Empire. The legion's service continued through Augustus's reign. They were deployed to Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula, to fight in the brutal Cantabrian Wars. These campaigns against the fierce mountain tribes of northern Spain were grinding affairs, asymmetric warfare in terrain that favored the defenders. The Cantabrians and Asturians fought from fortified hilltop settlements, using their knowledge of the rugged landscape to launch ambushes and raids before melting back into the mountains. The Romans responded with characteristic determination and ruthlessness. They built roads into the mountains, established forts to control key passes, and systematically reduced tribal strongholds one by one. The Ninth Legion spent years in this difficult terrain, far from the glory of set-piece battles, engaged in the unglamorous but essential work of pacification. It was during or after this service in Hispania that the Legion earned its honorific title, Hispana. The Ninth Legion had become Legio IX Hispana. As Augustus consolidated his empire and established the boundaries that would largely define Rome for centuries, legions were stationed at strategic points around the imperial frontier. The Ninth Legion found itself in Pannonia, a province along the Danube River in what is now Hungary and the Balkans. Here, they built fortifications, patrolled the frontier, and maintained the peace that Rome's military might impose. Pannonia was a crucial frontier zone, facing Germanic tribes across the Danube who constantly tested Roman strength. The legion's time here was marked by the routine of frontier garrison duty, punctuated by occasional campaigns against raiders and tribal confederations. They built roads and bridges, established supply depots, and trained local auxiliaries who would supplement the legion's strength. This was the reality of Roman military service for most soldiers, not constant warfare, but the patient, methodical work of maintaining an empire. But empires are never static. They expand and contract like living organisms, responding to threats and opportunities. In the year 43 of the Common Era, during the reign of Emperor Claudius, Rome returned to Britain. The first invasion under Caesar had been a raid, a demonstration of power. This time, Rome came to stay, and the Ninth Legion was among the 4 legions chosen for the conquest. The invasion of Britain was a massive undertaking. 40,000 soldiers crossed the Channel, supported by auxiliaries and supplies. They landed in what is now Kent and began their march inland. The British tribes, led by Caratacus and later by other resistance leaders, fought with desperate courage. But Roman discipline and organization proved overwhelming. The Ninth Legion distinguished itself in the early campaigns, helping to defeat the British tribes and establish Roman control over the southeast of the island. Britain was unlike anything the Mediterranean world had known. It was a land of mists and forests, of rain and rivers, of tribes that fought with desperate courage against the invaders. The climate was challenging for soldiers accustomed to Mediterranean warmth. The seemingly endless rain, the grey skies, the cold that penetrated woolen cloaks and leather armor, all of this must have seemed alien to legionaries from Italy or Spain. The Romans called the inhabitants Britons, and found them fierce, proud, and difficult to subdue. The Britons fought from chariots, a mode of warfare that seemed archaic to the Romans but which proved effective in Britain's terrain. Their warriors were brave to the point of recklessness, often fighting naked or nearly so, painted with blue woad, screaming their defiance. But Rome had perfected the art of conquest, and slowly, inexorably, the island came under imperial control. The Ninth Legion was stationed at Lindum, modern Lincoln, in the years following the invasion. They built their fortress with the precision and skill that characterized Roman military engineering. Stone by stone, they created a base that would serve as a center of power in the province. The fortress at Lincoln was typical of legionary fortifications, rectangular in plan, with strong walls and towers. Internal buildings arranged in orderly rows, workshops, granaries, headquarters, and barracks all carefully organized for maximum efficiency. But Britain was not yet pacified. But Britain would soon face one of the greatest challenges in the year 60 or 61 of the Common Era, while the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was campaigning in Wales, attempting to subdue the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, a sacred centre of Druidic religion. A catastrophic rebellion erupted in the east of Britain. The Iceni tribe, led by their queen Boudica, rose in furious revolt against Roman rule. The immediate cause was the brutal treatment of Boudica and her daughters by Roman officials after her husband, the client king Prasutagus, died and Roman authorities attempted to annex his kingdom. But the underlying cause was deeper. The resentment of a proud people subjected to foreign domination, heavy taxation, land confiscation, and the systematic destruction of their traditional culture and religion. Boudica's forces swept through the province with terrifying speed. They destroyed Camulodunum, modern Colchester, slaughtering the inhabitants and burning the town to the ground. Archaeological evidence still bears witness to this destruction, a layer of red ash marking the fury of that moment. The Temple of Claudius, where Roman citizens had taken refuge, was burned with the defenders inside. The rebels then turned their attention to Londinium, modern London, and Verulamium, modern Street, Albans, leaving similar devastation in their wake. The historical accounts describe scenes of extraordinary violence. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, claimed that the rebels killed between 70 and 80,000 Romans and their allies, taking no prisoners, showing no mercy. Whether these numbers are accurate or exaggerated for dramatic effect, the revolt clearly represented a massive threat to Roman control of Britain. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Rome might be driven from the island entirely. The Ninth Legion, under the command of Quintus Petilius Cerealis, marched south from Lincoln to confront the rebellion. But they were caught unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the British assault. In a battle whose exact location is lost to history, Boudica's forces fell upon the legion with devastating effect. The infantry, the heart of any legion, was annihilated. Contemporary accounts suggest that only Cerealis and his cavalry managed to escape, fleeing back to the safety of their fortress at Lincoln. This was perhaps the darkest moment in the Ninth Legion's history. To lose the infantry was to lose the legion's soul, its fighting power, its honor. The loss would have been devastating not just in practical military terms, but psychologically. The legion's eagle standard, its most sacred symbol, may have been lost or narrowly saved. The shame of such a defeat would have haunted the survivors. But Rome did not abandon its eagles easily. The legion was reconstituted, rebuilt with reinforcements from other provinces, given fresh recruits and veterans transferred from other units, and provided a chance to redeem itself. Boudica's rebellion was eventually crushed with characteristic Roman thoroughness. Suetonius Paulinus returned from Wales, gathered his forces, and met the rebel army in battle at an unknown location somewhere in the Midlands. Roman discipline triumphed over British courage, and the rebellion collapsed. Boudica herself took poison rather than face capture. The Ninth Legion, rebuilt and reinforced, continued its service in Britain. The decades that followed saw the Ninth Legion gradually moving northward as Rome extended its control over more of the island. By around 71 of the Common Era, they had established a new fortress at Eboracum, modern York. This would become one of the most important military bases in Roman Britain, a launching point for campaigns into the unconquered territories beyond, and the legion's home for the next several decades. York in the Roman period was a far cry from the medieval city that would later rise on its foundations. It was a military town first and foremost, a place of barracks and workshops, temples and bathhouses, all enclosed within the protective embrace of stone walls. The fortress sat at the confluence of two rivers, the Ouse and the Foss, providing strategic control over the surrounding region and excellent water transport links. The location was chosen with typical Roman strategic insight. The rivers provided natural defenses and transportation routes. The surrounding land was fertile, capable of supplying the fortress with food, and the position allowed the legion to control the vital north-south route through Britain, while also serving as a base for operations against the unconquered tribes of the north. The Ninth Legion made York their home for decades. They rebuilt their fortress in stone during the reign of Emperor Trajan, replacing earlier timber structures with permanent fortifications that spoke to Rome's intention to hold Britain indefinitely. This was not a temporary camp, but a statement of permanence, a declaration that Rome had come to stay. An inscription found at York, dating to 108 years of the Common Era, commemorates this construction work. It reads, "The Emperor Caesar, Nerva Trajan, Augustus, built this gate by the agency of the Ninth Legion Hispana." The inscription is matter of fact, bureaucratic even, yet it represents something profound. The last definitive, datable evidence of the Ninth Legion in Britain. 108 years of the Common Era. Beyond this point, the trail becomes murky, contradictory, a matter of inference and speculation rather than clear documentary evidence. This inscription, now preserved in the Yorkshire Museum, has been studied intensively by scholars. The lettering is clear and professional, carved by skilled stonemasons attached to the legion. The text follows standard Roman formulae for such commemorative inscriptions. Everything about it speaks to routine, to a legion settled in its quarters, engaged in normal peacetime activities. There is nothing to suggest that within a few years, the legion would vanish from history. Understanding what happened to the Ninth Legion requires us to understand the broader context of Britain in the early 2nd century. The province was never fully pacified. To the north lay Caledonia, the land of the fierce tribes the Romans called Caledonii and Maetai, inhabitants of what is now Scotland. These people had never been fully conquered, despite repeated Roman campaigns into their territory, and the border between Roman Britain and Caledonia was a zone of constant tension. Roman governors launched periodic campaigns into Caledonia, attempting to extend imperial control, or at least to punish raids into the province. The most famous of these campaigns occurred under Agricola in the years 79 to 84, culminating in the Battle of Mons Graupius, where the Romans claimed a great victory. But even after such victories, Roman control of Caledonia proved impossible to maintain. The territory was difficult, mountainous in places, covered in dense forests in others, a landscape that favored the defenders. The tribes fought using guerrilla tactics, avoiding set-piece battles in favor of ambushes and raids, melting away into the highlands when Roman forces grew too strong. This was warfare of a different character than the legions were designed for. The Roman military machine excelled at formal battles, at the disciplined clash of organized armies, but against an enemy who refused to fight on Roman terms, who struck and vanished, the legions found themselves at a disadvantage. The question that has puzzled historians for over a century is simple to state, but impossible to answer with certainty. What happened to the Ninth Legion? When did it disappear? Where? And why? These questions have generated numerous theories, each supported by fragments of evidence, each undermined by the absence of definitive proof. The traditional theory, popularized by the 19th century German historian Theodor Mommsen, proposed that the Ninth Legion was destroyed in battle against the northern tribes, sometime around 120 of the Common Era. Mommsen noticed that during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138, there appeared to be a major military crisis in Britain. Hadrian himself visited the province around 122, an unusual step that suggested serious problems requiring imperial attention. Moreover, Hadrian initiated the construction of the famous wall that bears his name, a massive fortification stretching from coast to coast across the narrow neck of northern Britain, from the Tyne to the Solway Firth, a distance of some 80 Roman miles. This wall represented a fundamental shift in Roman strategy, a decision to consolidate and defend rather than continue attempting to conquer Caledonia. The wall itself was an extraordinary undertaking. It consisted of a stone wall, in some sections up to 15 feet high, with a ditch on the northern side, a military road on the southern side, and forts stationed at intervals along its length. The construction required millions of precisely cut stones, thousands of workers, and years of labor. It was a permanent boundary, a statement that Rome had reached the limit of its expansion in Britain. To Mommsen and many who followed him, these facts suggested a catastrophic military defeat that destroyed or severely damaged the Ninth Legion, forcing a complete rethinking of Britain's defense. The wall was Rome's admission that it could not conquer Caledonia, that a permanent defensive line was necessary to protect the province from northern raiders. This theory captured popular imagination because it fit the romantic notion of a lost legion, of 5,000 men marching into the mists of Caledonia, never to return. It was dramatic, tragic, and seemingly supported by the historical evidence. The image of Roman eagles disappearing into barbarian lands became a staple of historical fiction. Rosemary Sutcliffe's novel, The Eagle of the Ninth, published in 1954, cemented this version of events in popular culture, depicting the legion's destruction in a battle beyond the frontier. The novel, which has never been out of print and has been adapted multiple times for film and television, tells of a young Roman officer searching for the lost eagle standard of his father's legion, destroyed in Caledonia. It's a powerful story, combining adventure, honor, and the mystery of historical loss. For many people, this fictional account has become their primary understanding of the Ninth Legion's fate, demonstrating how historical mysteries can be shaped as much by imagination as by evidence. But history is rarely as simple or as dramatic as fiction requires it to be. As archaeological evidence accumulated throughout the 20th century, this traditional theory began to show serious cracks. The evidence suggested a very different, more prosaic explanation for the Ninth Legion's disappearance from Britain. The first major challenge to the traditional theory came from excavations at the legionary fortress in York itself. If the Ninth Legion had been destroyed in a catastrophic battle in Caledonia, one would expect to find evidence of this disaster at their home base. The fortress might show signs of hasty abandonment or destruction by enemy attack, or at minimum, evidence of crisis and reorganization. But archaeological evidence revealed nothing of the sort. The fortress at York showed no signs of destruction during this period. Instead, the evidence suggested a normal, orderly transition. The buildings were maintained, repaired, and eventually rebuilt when another legion took over the site. There was no sudden break in occupation, no layer of destruction debris, no hordes of buried valuables that might indicate panic. Everything pointed to a planned, organized departure rather than a catastrophic loss. Even more significantly, evidence began to emerge that the Ninth Legion, or at least elements of it, had been present elsewhere in the Empire after 108. In 1959, excavations at Nijmegen in the Netherlands, the site of the Roman fortress, Noviomagus Batavorum, uncovered roof tiles stamped with the mark of the Ninth Legion. These tiles were dated to sometime between 104 and 120 of the Common Era, based on associated archaeological finds and the known occupation sequence of the fortress. The presence of the Ninth Legion's tiles at Nijmegen was remarkable because it suggested the legion, or a significant detachment from it, had been transferred from Britain to the Rhine frontier. This was not unprecedented in Roman military practice. Legions were regularly moved around the empire in response to military needs. The Rhine and Danube frontiers required constant reinforcement as Germanic tribes pressed against Rome's borders, and Britain could spare troops during periods of relative calm. Further evidence supported this theory of transfer rather than destruction. An inscription found at Nijmegen mentioned a senior officer, Lucius Aemilius Carus, who had served with the Ninth Legion. The archaeological evidence suggested that the Ninth had replaced another legion, the 10th Gemina. At Nijmegen, sometime after 104, when the 10th was transferred to the Danube frontier to participate in Trajan's Dacian wars. If the 9th Legion was at Nijmegen around 120, it clearly had not been destroyed in Britain around that same time. The traditional theory was wrong, or at least incomplete, but this created new questions. If the Legion was transferred from Britain, why? And what happened to it after Nijmegen? Because by the middle of the 2nd century, The Ninth Legion had definitely disappeared from all Roman records. During the reign of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180, a document was compiled listing all the legions of the Roman Empire. This document, preserved in part through later copies and inscriptions, does not mention the Ninth Legion. By 161 at the latest, the legion had ceased to exist as a formal unit of the Roman army. The list of legions from Marcus Aurelius's reign is particularly significant because it appears to be comprehensive and official. It was not compiled by a historian who might have overlooked a unit, but by imperial administrators who needed accurate information for military planning and budgeting. The absence of the Ninth from this list strongly suggests that by this date, the legion had been formally disbanded or destroyed. So the mystery shifts. Not when was the Ninth Legion destroyed in Britain, but rather what happened to the Ninth Legion after it left Britain, and when did it cease to exist? This is a less dramatic question perhaps, but no less intriguing and far more consistent with the archaeological evidence. Several theories have been proposed to explain the legion's final disappearance. One suggests that the Ninth was destroyed during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, which lasted from 132 to 135 of the Common Era. This was a massive and costly rebellion by the Jewish population against Roman rule, one of the bloodiest conflicts in Roman history. The Romans were forced to bring in legions from across the empire to suppress the revolt, and casualties were severe. We know that at least one Roman legion, the 22nd Deotariana, disappeared during this period and may have been destroyed in the fighting. Could the Ninth have met the same fate? The timing is plausible. If the Ninth was still at Nijmegen around 120, it could have been transferred east in response to the brewing crisis in Judea. The revolt was so severe that Hadrian himself came to the region to oversee its suppression, bringing massive reinforcements from across the empire. The Bar Kokhba revolt was characterized by brutal guerrilla warfare. The Jewish rebels, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, controlled much of Judea for several years, establishing an independent state with its own administration and coinage. The Romans had to systematically reduce rebel strongholds, often fortified caves in the Judean desert, in fighting that was slow, grinding, and costly. Roman casualties were so high that when Hadrian reported to the Senate on the war's conclusion, he notably omitted the traditional opening formula, "I and the army are well," suggesting losses so severe they could not be glossed over with conventional rhetoric. However, there is no direct evidence that the Ninth Legion participated in the Bar Kokhba revolt. No inscriptions, no archaeological finds, no mentions in the historical accounts of the war specifically place the legion in Judea. The theory remains possible but unproven, supported only by the timing and the known fact that at least one legion was lost during this conflict. Another theory suggests that the Ninth Legion was transferred further east to the Parthian frontier and was destroyed in warfare against Rome's great eastern rival. The Parthian Empire, centered in what is now Iran and Iraq, was the only power that could challenge Rome on equal terms, and the eastern frontier was a zone of constant, grinding warfare. Legions stationed there faced not tribal raiders but a sophisticated military machine with heavy cavalry, horse archers, and fortified cities. The Parthians had humiliated Rome before, most notably at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 years before the Common Era, where they destroyed 7 legions and killed the triumvir Crassus. The memory of that disaster haunted Roman military thinking, and subsequent campaigns in the east were planned with extreme caution. But warfare with Parthia continued intermittently throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries, with neither side able to achieve lasting dominance. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, around 161, a major Roman disaster occurred in the east when the Parthians invaded Syria and defeated Roman forces. Could the Ninth have been among the legions lost in this catastrophe? Again, the timing is plausible, but there is no direct evidence linking the Ninth to these events. The eastern frontier was so distant from the empire's western provinces that news and records from there were often fragmentary and delayed. A third theory, perhaps less dramatic but increasingly accepted by scholars, is that the Ninth Legion was simply disbanded. This was not a rare occurrence in Roman military history. Legions could be dissolved for various reasons: severe losses that made reconstitution impractical, disciplinary issues that made the unit unreliable, or simple administrative rationalization. When the emperor decided the empire had more legions than it needed in a particular region. If the Ninth Legion suffered heavy casualties at some point after leaving Britain, whether in Judea, on the Parthian frontier, or elsewhere, it might have been more practical to distribute the survivors among other units rather than rebuild the legion from scratch. The Eagle standard would be retired with honor. The legion's number would be removed from the active rolls, and the Ninth would cease to exist, not with a dramatic last stand, but with an administrative decision filed away in some imperial archive that has long since turned to dust. This theory lacks the romance of the traditional story, but it has the virtue of fitting what we know about Roman military practice. The Romans were pragmatists above all else. If a legion had lost so many men that it could not function effectively, and if rebuilding it was impractical or undesirable for whatever reason, they would simply eliminate it from the rolls and move on. There was no shame in this, no dishonor to the unit's memory. It was simply practical administration of a vast military machine. The evidence, such as it is, seems to point in this direction. The Ninth Legion did not disappear in a single catastrophic moment. Instead, it faded from the records over a period of perhaps 20 to 30 years. Sometime between 120 and 150 of the Common Era, it was transferred from Britain to the Rhine. Possibly then to the eastern provinces, suffered losses at some point, and was eventually disbanded. But mysteries have a way of resisting neat solutions, and even as scholarship has moved toward this more prosaic explanation, questions remain. Why was the legion transferred from Britain in the first place? Britain was never fully pacified, and losing a legion would have significantly weakened the province's defenses. Was there a specific crisis elsewhere in the empire that required the Ninth's deployment? Or was it simply routine reassignment, the kind of administrative shuffling that empires engage in constantly? And what of the soldiers themselves, the 5,000 men who comprised the legion at any given time? Legionaries served for 25 years, and during that time they became part of a military family. Their legion was their identity, their pride, their home. When the Ninth was disbanded, what happened to these men? Were they distributed among other legions, carrying the memory of the Ninth with them? Did some retire with grants of land, settling in colonies around the empire, telling stories of their service to grandchildren who would never know the Ninth had existed? The archaeological record offers tantalizing glimpses but few answers. At York, life continued after the Ninth departed. Another legion, the 6th Victrix, replaced them and would remain there for the rest of Roman Britain's existence. The fortress was rebuilt and expanded. The city grew and prospered, but somewhere in the layers of York's ancient foundations, there may still be evidence of the Ninth waiting to be discovered. Modern archaeologists working at York have uncovered extraordinary details of Roman life. They've found the remains of bathhouses and temples, workshops and barracks, sewers and water systems. They've discovered tombstones of individual soldiers, some with touching personal details. But, of the Ninth Legion's specific fate, the archaeological evidence remains frustratingly silent. At Nijmegen, the traces are frustratingly partial. Those roof tiles with the Legion's stamp, a few other artifacts, but nothing that tells us definitively when the Ninth arrived, how long it stayed, or where it went next. The soil holds its secrets close, and even modern archaeological techniques can only reveal so much. In recent years, new technologies have brought fresh hope to solving the mystery. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and other remote sensing techniques have allowed archaeologists to survey sites without excavation, revealing hidden structures and potential locations for future investigation. DNA analysis has opened new possibilities for studying ancient remains, potentially allowing researchers to trace family connections and migration patterns. Digital humanities projects have begun systematically analyzing all known inscriptions and documents from the Roman period, looking for overlooked references that might shed light on the Ninth's fate. Yet despite all these modern tools, the fundamental mystery remains. We know the Ninth Legion existed. We know it served with distinction for over 150 years. We know it was in Britain and then it was not. And we know that by the reign of Marcus Aurelius it had ceased to exist. But the precise circumstances of its end remain unknown. There is something profoundly moving about this ignorance, this gap in our knowledge. The Roman Empire was perhaps history's most bureaucratic state. It kept records of everything, from tax receipts to military deployments, from building inscriptions to soldiers' discharge papers. Yet a whole legion, 5,000 men and all their equipment, their history and their fate, somehow slipped through the cracks of this vast administrative apparatus and vanished from history. In a way, the mystery of the Ninth Legion speaks to a larger truth about history itself. We know so much about the Roman Empire. We can read the letters of emperors and the accounts of historians. We can walk through preserved cities like Pompeii, examining buildings, reading graffiti, studying artifacts. We can reconstruct, with reasonable accuracy, how Romans lived, what they believed, how they organized their society, and projected their power across 3 continents. Yet despite all this knowledge, there remain profound gaps, questions we cannot answer, mysteries that persist despite centuries of scholarship. The past is not a book we can simply read from cover to cover. It is more like a fragmentary scroll, with pages missing, whole sections lost to time, fire, and neglect. We read what remains and try to imagine what has been lost, but our imagination, however educated, can never fully restore what time has taken. The Ninth Legion marched across Europe for generations, from Gaul to Germany, from Spain to the Danube, from Britain to, perhaps, the deserts of the Middle East. They built roads and fortresses, fought battles, kept the peace, and enforced Rome's will on conquered peoples. They were fathers and sons, brothers and friends, bound together by oath and discipline and the shared hardships of military life. Each man in the legion had a name, a story, dreams of returning home or building a new life in a distant province. They laughed and argued, gambled and drank, loved and lost, lived lives as real and complex as our own. And now they are gone, so completely that we don't even know how or where or precisely when they met their end. There is something deeply human in our need to know what happened to them. It's not just historical curiosity, though that certainly drives much of the scholarly interest. It's also a sense that these men deserve to be remembered, that their story should not end with a bureaucratic notation or the absence of one. They were the instruments of empire, yes, but they were also individuals who experienced joy and suffering, triumph and defeat, and whose lives mattered. Consider for a moment what it meant to be a legionary in the early 2nd century. You would have joined in your late teens or early 20s, signing up for 25 years of service. You would have been issued your equipment, taken your oath of loyalty to the emperor, and begun the brutal training that would transform you into a soldier. You would have learned to march 20 miles in 5 hours while carrying 60 pounds of equipment. You would have practiced with your sword and shield until the movements became instinctive. You would have built fortifications and roads, learned to swim rivers in full armor, and mastered the complex maneuvers that made Roman legions nearly invincible in open battle. But you would also have lived a life beyond military duties. You would have formed friendships with your tent mates, the 7 other men with whom you shared a leather tent on campaign and a barrack room in garrison. You might have had a common-law wife, since legionaries were not officially allowed to marry during their service, though many did so informally. You might have had children, growing up in the civilian settlements that clustered around every legionary fortress. You would have worshipped the gods of Rome, participated in military religious ceremonies, perhaps adopted local deities as well. And after 25 years, if you survived, you would receive your discharge. You would be given a plot of land, often in a veterans' colony, established specifically for retired soldiers. You would receive a diploma, a bronze document certifying your service and granting you Roman citizenship if you didn't already have it. You would finally be allowed to legally marry. You would settle down, perhaps to farm your land grant, perhaps to open a shop or tavern. living off your savings and your veteran's pension. You would watch your children grow, tell them stories of your service, and eventually die and be buried with a tombstone marking your years in the Legion. This was the expected arc of a legionary's life. But for the men of the Ninth Legion who served in its final decades, this peaceful retirement never came. Something happened to them, and we don't know what. As you continue to relax into sleep, or deeper into sleep if you're already there, let yourself contemplate this long march of the Ninth Legion through history. Imagine the sound of 5,000 men on the move, the rhythmic tramp of military sandals on stone roads, the creak of leather armor, the clink of metal equipment. Imagine the voices speaking Latin, that language that was once the tongue of emperors and is now studied only by scholars, preserved in texts and inscriptions, but no longer living on any human tongue. The legionaries of the Ninth spoke a rougher Latin than the poets and orators of Rome. They spoke the Latin of the campfire and the barracks, full of military slang and regional accents, the lingua franca of an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. If we could somehow hear their voices across the centuries, would we recognize the language? Would their jokes translate? Would their concerns, their hopes, their fears resonate with our own? Almost certainly, they would. The specifics of their lives were different from ours, shaped by different technologies and social structures, different beliefs and expectations. But the fundamentals of human experience transcend these differences. They knew friendship and loneliness, courage and fear, love and loss, just as we do. They wondered about their futures, remembered their pasts, tried to find meaning in their present, just as we do. The mystery of their disappearance connects us to them across nearly 2,000 years. Every historian who has puzzled over the fragmentary evidence, every archaeologist who has carefully excavated Roman sites, hoping to find some clue, every novelist who has imagined the Legion's final days, every person who has heard this story and wondered what really happened. All of us are keeping the Ninth Legion alive in some small way. They marched into history's fog and never emerged. But we remember that they were there. We remember that they existed, that they mattered, that their story, however incomplete, deserves to be told. In our remembering, we honor them, these vanished soldiers of a vanished empire, these men who became a mystery. The scholarly debate about the Ninth Legion continues today. Academic conferences still feature papers proposing new theories or re-examining old evidence. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with the Legion continue to yield new finds, each artifact carefully catalogued, analyzed, and compared with existing evidence. Perhaps one day, a discovery will emerge that finally solves the mystery. A cache of military documents preserved in some unlikely location, an inscription that mentions the Legion's final deployment and fate, a mass grave that can be definitively linked to the Ninth through artifacts or inscriptions. Or perhaps the mystery will remain forever unsolved. Perhaps the evidence simply doesn't exist anymore, lost to time and decay and the countless accidents that destroy historical records. Perhaps we will never know with certainty what happened to the Ninth Legion, and future generations will continue to puzzle over the same fragmentary clues we have today. As we near the end of our journey through this ancient enigma, it's worth reflecting on what mysteries like this offer us. In our modern world, we are accustomed to having answers. We can look up facts instantly, access vast databases of information, solve most questions with a few keystrokes or voice commands. The idea that something could simply be unknown, that a question could remain unanswered despite centuries of inquiry, is almost foreign to our experience. Yet here is the Ninth Legion, refusing to yield its secrets despite all our tools and technologies, all our scholarly apparatus and methodological sophistication. The mystery persists not because we haven't tried to solve it, but because the evidence simply doesn't exist, or hasn't been found, or has been so scattered by time that it cannot be reassembled into a coherent narrative. There is something strangely comforting about this. A reminder that the world is larger and more complex than our ability to fully comprehend it. Not everything can be known. Not every story has a clear ending. Some mysteries will outlast us, passing to future generations who will bring their own questions and methods to bear, and who may or may not find answers that elude us. The Ninth Legion's story is also a reminder of the fragility of memory, of how easily the past can slip away. The Romans seemed permanent to themselves, their empire destined to last forever. The legions were institutions that had existed for centuries and showed no signs of disappearing. Individual soldiers might die, but the legion itself seemed eternal, its identity passed down from generation to generation of recruits. Yet now their empire is dust, their roads cracked and overgrown, their buildings ruins haunted by tourists and scholars, and one of their legions, a unit that served for over 150 years, has become a mystery that may never be fully solved. If the mighty Ninth Legion could vanish so completely, what hope have any of us of being remembered? But perhaps that's not the right question. Perhaps what matters is not whether we're remembered, but what we do while we're here. The soldiers of the Ninth Legion lived their lives, served their empire, built their roads and fortresses, raised their children, and eventually died, as all humans must. Their names are mostly forgotten, their individual stories lost. But they existed. They mattered. They were real. What will remain of our own time, 2,000 years hence? What mysteries will future archaeologists puzzle over as they examine the fragments of our civilization? What questions about our world will remain unanswerable, lost in the passage of centuries? These thoughts can be sobering, but they can also be strangely liberating, a reminder to focus on what matters in the present, rather than worrying too much about posterity. The soldiers of the Ninth Legion could not have known they would become a mystery. They thought of themselves simply as soldiers doing their duty, serving their time, hoping to survive and earn their discharge with its promise of land and citizenship. They had no idea that scholars 2 millennia later would puzzle over their fate, that their disappearance would inspire novels and academic debates, that their story would be told to help someone drift off to sleep on a night in a world they could never have imagined. But here we are, connected across time by mystery and wonder, by the human need to understand and remember. The Ninth Legion marched from Gaul to Britain, to wherever they went next. They left their mark in inscriptions and roof tiles, in the stones of York and the soil of Nijmegen. And then they vanished, becoming more legend than history, more question than answer. The beach where the Somerton man died looks much the same today as it did in 1948. Similarly, the sites where the Ninth Legion once stood guard look different now, covered by modern cities or farmland. But the land itself remembers. At York, if you know where to look, you can still trace the outline of the Roman fortress beneath the medieval and modern city. The Roman walls still stand in places, incorporated into later fortifications. The rivers still flow as they did when legionaries stood watch on their banks. At Nijmegen, archaeological excavations have revealed layers of Roman occupation. The fortress walls, the barracks, the workshops, all have left traces in the soil. And among those traces are those roof tiles stamped with the mark of the Ninth Legion, silent witnesses to a presence that has otherwise vanished from history. These physical traces are all that remain, these fragments of stone and pottery, these inscriptions carved by men whose hands have been dust for 2,000 years. We touch these artifacts in museums, we read these inscriptions in scholarly publications. But the gap between us and them is vast, unbridgeable except through imagination and scholarship. And now, dear listener, our story draws to its close, or rather, to its deliberate lack of closure. The mystery of the Ninth Legion remains unsolved. Perhaps it will always remain so. Perhaps somewhere, in an unexcavated site, or a forgotten archive, evidence waits that could solve the puzzle definitively. Or perhaps the answer is already known, scattered across multiple sources that no one has yet connected in quite the right way. But for tonight, for now, we can let the mystery be what it is. Of the countless stories lost to time, of the men who marched and fought and died for an empire that is now as vanished as they are. Their legacy is this mystery, this question that keeps their memory alive in a way that simple facts never could. Let your breathing slow and deepen, matching the timeless rhythm of waves on a distant shore, or wind through ancient ruins, or the patient accumulation of years burying the past beneath layers of earth and forgetting. You need not solve any mysteries tonight. You need not answer any questions. Simply rest, knowing that some things are meant to remain unknown, that some stories are most powerful in their incompleteness. The Ninth Legion has marched on through history, from the campaigns of Caesar to the frontiers of Britain, from the certain ground of documented fact into the misty realm of speculation and mystery. And in that mist, they remain, frozen in time, forever marching toward an unknown destination, forever paused at the edge of history's memory. Think of how many small mysteries populate our own lives. The stranger whose eyes met ours meaningfully on a train, then disappeared into the crowd. The letter that arrived with no return address. The object found in an old coat pocket that we can't remember acquiring. These small mysteries add texture to our existence, reminders that life is larger and stranger than our daily routines might suggest. The Ninth Legion's mystery has now become part of your story too, a narrative you carry with you into sleep. Perhaps tonight you'll dream of ancient roads and distant frontiers, of eagles carried into the unknown, of men who chose to become nobody and in doing so, became everybody's mystery. These dreams, should they come, are gifts from your sleeping mind, weaving new patterns from old threads, creating your own interpretations of this endless story. Consider how the Ninth Legion's final march might have unfolded. Did they know they were marching toward their end? Did they look back at York, at the fortress they had called home for decades, knowing they would never return? Or did they think it was just another deployment, another routine transfer, with the expectation of eventually returning to Britain or settling in some new province? We'll never know their final thoughts, just as we'll never fully know the final thoughts of anyone, even those closest to us. We are all, in the end, mysteries to one another, carrying our secret codes, our hidden pockets of meaning that others can only guess at. The Ninth Legion simply made this universal truth visible, tangible, undeniable. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of ancient roads and distant frontiers, of eagles carried into the unknown, of men whose names we will never know but whose story we will always remember. Incomplete as it is, the Silent Archives thanks you for joining us tonight in contemplating this ancient mystery. Until we meet again in that quiet space between waking and sleeping, between known and unknown, between history and legend, rest peacefully. The mystery remains, and in remaining, it endures. The Ninth Legion marches on through time, forever present in their absence, forever remembered in their forgetting, forever alive in the questions they left behind. Tamam shud. As the Somerton man might have said, it is ended. Or perhaps, in the way of all good mysteries, it has just begun.